He has never said no to us. He has probably spoken in at least 8 to 10 events that we have hosted both at our campus and in Delhi. And he has always been a great source of encouragement and support for many years for us, but also has been a great source of inspiration for me personally, all the way from my days at the Faculty of Law, University of Delhi in the early 90s. And I'm very delighted that he has accepted our invitation and is speaking in this forum. I also want to extend a warm welcome to Professor Alka Acharya from the Institute of Chinese Studies, Director and Senior Fellow there, for her support to the Center for India-China Studies and indeed our university. She has also been a great friend of our university and also continuing to support our endeavors, and I appreciate her participation in this seminar. I also want to recognize the presence of Mr. Liu Jinsong, Minister of Chinese Embassy in India. He has kindly accepted to deliver the special address. As some of you know, we have very close ties with the Chinese embassy, as well as many aspects of Chinese engagement in India, as well as the kind of relationship that we've established with the leading Chinese universities. We have extensive relationship with the Peking University, Renmin University, the Tsinghua University, the Fudan University, the East China University of Political Science and Law, as well as many other universities in China. The history and evolution of the Center for India-China Studies at our university was to recognize the importance of the relationship between two largest countries in the world, which had historically very strong and continue to build those historical relationship. The fact of the matter is that with over 850 million people in India who are less than 35 years of age, these young people of India will not only shape the future of India, but also will shape the future of the world. And it is important for us to bring a greater sense of vision and imagination of China into India. I've always lamented about the fact that we know very little of India. We care very little of India, of China, in the sense of engagement with China. And also our academic institutions have very little perspective of China beyond what we see in the headlines and in the newspapers, most of the time not so in a positive light. And I have, having taught in Hong Kong for 6 years and having also taught in China, I can say that many Chinese academics have a greater sense of interest in knowing about India and wanting to learn about India and even learn about India and India's governance and how we address the big issues of diversity, inclusion, and also pluralism as well as democracy. These are issues that Chinese are wanting to and eager to learn from the experience of India. I would like to see a greater sense of recognition of that mutual learning experiences within India, and academic institutions and universities have a very important role to play. I'm also particularly delighted that we are hosting this seminar right at the eve of the inauguration and indeed the launch of the 6th school of the Jindal Global University, the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. We've just had a few faculty members recruited, and we are beginning the first academic session of this school on 1st of August 2017 with the first cohort of around 60 students who will be joining the BA in Media and Communication as an interdisciplinary undergraduate program. We are building on the experiences of the 5 different schools: the Law School, the Business School, the School of International Affairs, the School of Government and Public Policy, and the School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. Lastly, I want to mention that this university was created as a philanthropic initiative of our founding chancellor, Mr. Jindal, and one of the objectives of the university was to advance new ideas and new perspectives and to challenge status quo in almost all aspects of public thinking with a view to creating a new framework of higher education imagination in India. We have lamented about the fact that not a single Indian university is one of the top 200 in the world. No less than the President of India, but also many others have argued about the need for raising the quality of higher education and the quality of academic engagement. And one of the reasons for this situation is the fact that our universities are not research-oriented universities. At best, they are teaching institutions, and sometimes we don't even do that better. So The objective of the Center for India-China Studies and the larger university itself is to promote research and knowledge creation and publications with a view to advancing the thinking that needs to be developed within academic institutions. We had humble beginnings in the year 2009 with only 100 students and 10 faculty members, and today we have grown into a multidisciplinary university with over 225 full-time faculty members and nearly 3,000 students. We don't expect to become large. We will slowly grow and evolve in the next 3 to 4 years with, say, around 5,000 to 6,000 students, and progressively in the next 8 to 10 years, our aspiration is to be having around 10,000 plus students. That's approximately the strength of Princeton University. Princeton is a small university, unlike many other American universities, but Princeton has a large undergraduate cohort and a very strong research culture, including research centers. Our aspiration is to evolve a type of a university which emphasizes those aspects of it. So once again, I want to thank all of you to be present and to be participating in this important dialogue, and we hope to build on this dialogue to recognize the need for the China-India media relations to be focusing on the larger aspect of improving the existing relationship and also having a stronger representative engagement in the context of what is considered as news and newsworthy. I once again thank my colleagues, Dr. Suruchi, Pankaj, as well as Wenjuan, the director of the Center for India-China Studies, for their leadership and their vision to be able to organize this seminar. Thank you. I now invite Professor Alka Acharya, Director and Senior Fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies, to deliver her keynote address.
Good morning, everybody. Professor Rajkumar, Mr. Manishankar Iyer, Mr. Liu Chun-sung, my good friend Wenchuan, with whom we first began to interact and now have a really good partnership, and all you eminent, distinguished scholars and academics. This is an honor that I do not deserve, and I wonder whether it is because I have consistently advocated better relations between India and China, or whether I have been better at representing this. But seriously, I must say that I was quite struck by the framing of the theme of this seminar: better relations, better representation. And I spent some time pondering on the implications of this formulation. There is almost a cause and effect linkage that comes across very strongly, a dialectical relationship, as it were. But it poses to me the question that could well be the running thread in this seminar. If there are better relations, will there be better representation? Or will better representation lead to better relations between India and China? So there we have a riddle wrapped in an enigma inside a mystery. The reverse proposition can be stated far more easily and without much quarrel, I think. If there are bad relations, they are duly represented as such, period. In a general manner of speaking, it is hardly surprising that under conditions of hostility or even war, each side will use whatever means are available to publicize and exaggerate the nefarious activities or the acts of the other, while denying or concealing similar actions by themselves. But what if the conditions are not actively hostile, but merely unfriendly, strained, somewhat tense? What if you have a situation where the relations are not bad, but far more complex than that? And yet, the representation is far from satisfactory in bringing out this complexity. And then the plot begins to thicken. Who is representing this reality? Who is it addressed to? What is the source? Who determines content? Between the ideas and the reality, between the reality and the representation, between the representation and the relationship, falls the shadow. Let me illustrate this. Our institute has a journal, China Report, which is now in its 54th year of continuous publication. In 2015, we had a special issue focused on this question of perception of each other by India and China. And there was one article by a scholar called Debashish Roy Chaudhary, who analyzed the projection of China in the Indian media. And let me quote very shortly from the study. Quote, I set out to determine the extent of hostile coverage of China in the Indian print media, particularly in the country's two most popular English language dailies, The Times of India and Hindustan Times. To do this, I categorized and then tallied all China-related stories in these papers over a 6-month period, using what communication scholars call frames. These are distinct narrative structures that ascribe set of meanings to events, which helps readers grasp the news, but often strip it of nuance and ambiguity. I divided the prevailing frames into two groups, adversarial and non-adversarial, and found the dominant share of stories to be unambiguously adversarial, portraying China as a rival power that needs to be countered. He goes on to say, I was careful to pick a time period, the first half of 2012, that was both fairly recent, reflective of usual China coverage, no major border face-offs or other events that could skew the data. He kept Tibet-related stories to one side, saying that these were neither adversarial nor non-adversarial, but they came with their own dominant preoccupations and perceptions. In one case, the Times of India, 60% of China-related stories over the period of study were adversarial. Corresponding number for Hindustan Times was 47.5%. Largest share of adversarial stories, about 36% in the Times of India and 32% in the Hindustan Times, fell under 3 related frames. He's titled them Border Tension Aggression, War Preparation, and Geopolitical Rivalry. Beyond just the numbers, unpacking these frames and understanding their component parts is revealing of the tropes Indian journalists regularly apply to China. Now, the study is very interesting. I will not go further. Than those who are interested, I can give the reference. It appeared in the August 2015 issue of China Report. The issue that he ultimately comes down to grapple with is whether legitimate security concerns of any nation, for that matter, are getting morphed into hostile memes, leading to strident nationalistic postures which preclude a rational and sensible debate in these matters. Very few studies actually on the media going on, and therefore I welcome this school that you are going to be setting up, because I think a closer study and analysis of what actually is happening with and in the media and how it is affecting the relationship needs to be looked at. As far as I know, the ORF in Kolkata has also undertaken a study. It's a much longer time frame, and they're in the middle of that. But that's also seeking to look at portrayal of China in the Indian media. This is embedded in a larger problem, which is that these tropes that have been identified by Roy Chaudhary's study appear to be the beginning and the end of our media's interest in China, despite the fact that China constitutes the greatest story of the century worldwide. Take, for instance, this moment. March is then generally described in China as the Lianghui season. Two of the most significant events, the National People's Congress and the CPPCC, are underway in China. This is a very critical time to observe, feel the pulse of Chinese politics. We in this country are blissfully unaware of these two major events that are happening. On cultural, social, religious issues, China could well be the proverbial black hole for us. But lest this be one-sided, the problem is on both sides. Let me mention that, and everybody is familiar in India, everybody, that is to say the reading public, is familiar with the Global Times. Its outrageous statements, which makes for great headlines. For the majority in India, this represents the official and non-official thinking in China. But Roy Chaudhary also points to the fact that Global Times or other state-controlled media is actually far more consciously tempered. Language is not as strident as you see on the social media. And yet this is actually the main framework within which we assess Chinese perceptions of us. Things get a lot uglier on the social media, where, as Roy Chaudhary puts it, China's army of ultra-nationalistic microbloggers who can now access Indian media in real time express their bemusement at antagonistic coverage in decidedly more unpleasant terms. Largely negative stories about India appear. They seem to constitute the dominant narrative. The rapes, the caste system, the inequalities, this seems to be of a far greater interest in the mainstream media in China. But there are people here better qualified than I am in this business of media studies, full-time researchers in the audience who are closely studying the problems attendant on representation, projection, and the most crucial aspect, the perceptions that are being generated and formed. This applies to the layman, but also in some respects to the specialist, and I think we have some very interesting presentations in the sessions lined up, so let me stop at that. I now speak with respect to us and what we are faced with in this country. The post-1962 period saw a transmogrification of both the reality and the representation of India-China relations. We have not yet emerged from the lengthy shadows cast by that episode in many ways. Let me not dwell on that. I think we are all here familiar with the problems that 1962 constitutes for us even today. However, for nearly a decade and a half now, a new generation of Indians has been experiencing the beginnings of a re-encounter with China. For the scholars and researchers engaged in the study of China, it is increasingly necessary to first deconstruct, or at any rate, be aware of the scratches on our minds, as Harold Isaacs put it in his study on American perceptions of China, the pictures in our heads that are formed by these mingled strands of the real and the imagined, pictures that were formed by the needs and nature of bygone times, dictates of very different circumstances, must be re-examined. The transformation of the last decade and a half, world over, within our neighborhood and within us, has been tumultuous and disorderly, and we are faced with the dire need to change the underpinnings of this very vital relationship that we are now confronting. This is history in a huge sense, which will require bringing in a shift in the way our people and cultures will be juxtaposed vis-a-vis each other. As we move from old ground to new, from old assumptions to new, we must consciously and constantly, and to some extent painfully, revise the images we have of each other. Maybe not entirely efface. There's some things you need to continuously learn from history as well, but absorbed, rearranged in a new design, and carefully consider how they are being represented. I apologize if I have come across as more rambling than precise, but this is not a topic that lends itself to straightforward solutions or presentations. So let me conclude by taking the easy way, taking the liberty of defining the key note, as it were, which seeks to pose some questions pertaining to the subject at hand. And let me state the 3 or 4 blocks that I would like to pick. What role does the media, and now we must talk of both traditional and social media, play in tackling this dialectical relationship between relations and representation? See, the problem is that we have now an increasingly porous environment, information environment. The larger public has access to criticisms made by politicians, opinion groups, media in each other's countries, which very often are unfriendly. So while the official positions, the statist positions, project a conservative, non-threatening picture, media voices tell another story. So we need to explore this contradiction, as it were. Secondly, how does the exponential expansion of the amount of information available change the game, the process. No news is no longer considered good news. The crucial issue is not that people have a right or not a right to publish, but people have a right to know, and right to know accurate, truthful, factual information on the basis of which they are entitled to make their opinions. Thirdly, what important effects have the internet and social media had on changing or molding or creating these perceptions, which in turn become a factor in domestic political calculations and then go on to shape policy? The ease with which propaganda, and I put it in quotes, can be disseminated is frequently attributed to modern information technology. So there are YouTube and smartphones, Facebook, Twitter. So to what extent has this internet and social media been able to challenge traditional media in terms of gaining ground, in terms of gaining an upper hand, or in terms of actually setting the terms of this representation? As a scholar and teacher, I'm actually concerned with one another dimension of this profusion and this interplay between what's happening on the social media, what's coming out in the traditional media, what professional opinion comes out, what scholarly opinion comes out, because the multiple platforms that are now offered by the internet today means that our young people are writing profusely, prolifically. And as I look at these writings and then the so-called research articles that eventually emerge, what concerns me is that the greater part of the references are now all from different media sources. A link is provided testifying to the source, as if that were all that is necessary to verify any fact or data. Trending article is repeated endlessly, cited endlessly, as if that is sufficient to clinch the argument. Everyone has their favorite quote or joke on the media. Mine is what Oscar Wilde said during this infamous trials he faced. The old days, men had the rack. Today, they have the media. You are being pulled and pushed in just about every possible way. Finally, the question is, would there be a better balance between relations and representations by exercising a degree of control? How useful has it been in the case of China? Does it help or hinder? Of course, in the current context, it evokes a much, much more explosive debate in our country, so maybe we can put it away for now. So have I made a case for an irresponsible media? No. I have indicated towards a problem that encompasses us all. Different voices must be permitted legitimate space, welcomed in the overall discourse. New interests, especially business and commercial interests, that have larger stakes in a relationship of mutually beneficial partnership must be called upon to have a greater voice, and this does not amount to letting the mainstream media off the hook. For make no mistake, it's been said that whoever controls the media controls the mind. Wang Shuo, the managing director of Caixin, a very popular online portal, has pointed out in the context of China as well, that professional journalism there has failed to temper social media and these explosive outpourings. And he describes the social media as public opinion on steroids, the opinion of the people, for the people, by the people. So finally, I would like to bring to your notice a kind of representation that is making the rounds on Chinese social media these days. It appeared in our Google group, and I think it bears repeating here, highly self-reflexive, that actually turns the gaze on oneself, brutal in its honesty, even irony, I would say. And the background for this is the intense debates that have been going on in the Chinese media over the stationing of the THAAD missiles in Korea. And so there's a lot of angry writing in the media, and there's a lot of protests happening on the social media. And this little poem is called Mang, Busy Hating. Anonymous, it came on the Weibo, and it's been translated by China Change. So it starts by saying, 早上很美国, 中午很韩国. Okay, let me get into the English. It says, in the morning, I hate America. After lunchtime, I hate Korea. In the evening, I hate the Japanese. I have to squeeze in hate for Singapore and the Taiwanese. Then at night, when I dream, I hate Vietnam and the Philippines. On Monday, I oppose Korea. On Tuesday, Japan. On Wednesday, it's the Americans. On Thursday, I oppose the independence of Taiwan. Friday, that of Hong Kong. Come Saturday, against independence of Tibet is what I am standing. On the Sabbath, it's that of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. My life is so wonderful and rich. Of everything else, I have no time to think or bitch. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, Professor Acharya. I'm sure that such a poem could be made for India at some level as well. So I will leave it for. I know, but for that's right. It is not fitted into the schedule, I'm sure. Now I call upon Mr. Liu Chinsong, Minister of Chinese Embassy in India, to deliver his special address.
And Director Acharya, Your Excellency MP Ayya, and Register Musi. I know that special address means should be special short. But I would like to speak a few words because I also share the view with Director Acharya. That's the theme of this forum, very good. It's a better relation, better representation. How can we do the better relation for China and India and a better representation, not only diplomats? I think should be based on some kind of new themes. I think the better stories is the most important thing, as my colleagues discuss and mention here. I would like to introduce today is one of the organizer and initiator for this forum, like the Professor Zhang Wenjuan. She made the story for better relation for China and India because she gave up a lot of other opportunities, very good career in American or mainland China, and her husband accompanied with him here only because of her. And she also made a lot of the stories here. He told us when he studied and teach in your university, he found something totally different with China. It's different of the culture. Some student of her student, if he want to absent from his class, he always like to make the grandma story. My grandma has some illness, not about parents, because the school has the telephone number of his parents, can take the phone immediately. But we don't know the telephone number of his grandpa or grandma. So that's one of the interesting thing. Another thing is a bubble head. For Chinese, we don't know about that. If you yes, not. If no, just shaking hands. But in India, it's totally different. Ask the question or in the classroom, always shaking hands. We don't know it's yes or not. I understand or don't understand. But fortunately, that means he is still listening for your voice. So that's totally different. And Professor Zhang made this story, and he written the articles, and will spread, very popular in China. I think she did excellent job, better than our journalist. Our journalists make a very, very tough job. But just a few days ago, when we met a Chinese delegation, some of the female, the student and the tourist, they told me they were scared about the news because from the news, especially the Chinese news on the newspaper, some things are all about the criminals cases in India. So the female tourists, they really very scared, and they make the very difficult decision to come to India. So that give me the very strong expression that the media is too important. And our bilateral, especially bilateral peoples-to-people exchange, and also especially for the tourism industry, highly rely on your report. I think the story right now is very important than the data and the figure or the facts. We know all the figures, like our bilateral trade go beyond of the 70 billion US dollars. We know our Chinese investment here more than 4.8 billion US dollars. We know there's about 13 pair of the sister province and Pradesh. But we don't know every day, every year, every month, how many of love story, how many of so excellent story behind of these kind of figures. We don't know that one of the Indian journalists, he stayed in Beijing for more than 8 years. He don't like to withdraw. And he married with a Chinese girl and has the excellent grand wedding ceremony in Beijing. All the Chinese media and his friends join with celebrate with him. We don't know that in China, our embassy yesterday night, we held the first, the holy reception for all the Indian medias. And the Indian media reporters very exciting. We have the fortunate lucky draw. Everyone feel very happy. And we don't know that right now more than 300 the Indian and the Chinese couple. Whoever the boy is India or girl is India, but they have the so happy family. They have the kids. They live in India or live in Shanghai or Beijing. They make the story. They make the better bridge and understanding for both two countries. We don't know that recently a very important story from the old Chinese soldier. His name is Wang Qi. He stayed in India more than half century. He was lost in the border conflict in 1962. Some people talking about is only focus for the border conflict, but our media friends, some of the Chinese media give the more focus for his experience in India. He was bullied by some of the bad guy, but he also get lot of assistance, help, get the love story in India because the majority of Indian people in the village, they are good guy. They helped us, they moved him. And even today, right now, he's so hesitant whether stay in China or still back in India. He makes it very hesitant to make the decision. So this kind of story moved us a lot. I think India and China, we along between us, we don't have the bamboo cotton, we don't have the Aru cotton, we even don't have any kind of wall between us. We only have the Himalaya. We only have so many of the rivers. This river is not for struggle, it's not for dispute. The river is for shared lives, shared feelings. So I think we really need more story. We need our reporter, our journalist, our radio, our media, and our social media to do more about the story, the real story, and the vivid person behind our story. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liu. I entirely share with you the importance of this relationship and the narrative that gets dominated in most of the media discourses is more to do with what governments do with each other and less to do with what peoples can do and are actually doing with each other. In fact, I remember very well when a couple of years ago we hosted 25 students from the Tsinghua University in an India immersion program in which they stayed on campus for a month. These are some of the most outstanding students. It was a sort of a India immersion program sponsored by the Chinese government. And the vision of the program was to identify young people, undergraduate students, to come to India and spend a month at our university, but also travel and to get to know of India. And these individuals in the decades to come will hold important positions of power and responsibility, and their vision of India ought to be shaped not only by what they learn and what they hear and what they read by being in China, but to experience life in its own forms and manifestations through an academic engagement, through civil society conversations, through interactions with students and faculty, and to travel a bit across India. And that experience, many of us were indeed moved by that experience in the sense that when the students talked about it when they were leaving, both the Indian students and the Chinese students and the faculty members, it was it truly elevated a deeper sense of humanity that was indeed possible when people come together. So thank you very much, Mr. Liu. Now I call upon Mr. Manishankar Iyer, former Member of Parliament and member of the Indian National Congress, to deliver his inaugural address.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, Professor Alka Acharya, Minister Liu Jisong, Suruchi ji, and friends. I have been twice over this morning introduced to you as a member of the Indian Congress. I should therefore clarify that I have a very individual view on China, which is not shared by my party. And if you want to hear what the party thinks of China, go to the party. I've come here to share with you my perception at this age of 76 of what I think of India-China relations and where I think this should be taken. I unhesitatingly say that I am a child of the Hindi-China Chini Bhai Bhai era. It was a very exciting thought to be 13 or 14 years old and feel that we were throwing away these imperial shackles by two mighty post-colonial countries rising to the fore, sharing experiences with each other and moving forward to change a world that was totally dominated at that time by the Western powers, who were reluctant, on the one hand, the older imperial powers, to shed their empires, and the new imperial power was only too keen on taking it up. And we found ourselves again and again and again clashing with the old world order and believing that the new world order would have as a fundamental axis a very strong relationship between New Delhi and what in those bad old days we used to call Peking. That changed when I moved from adolescence into becoming a young man. And I suffered in consequence of that. I suffered because when we had what I was very glad to hear described as the 1962 border conflict and not as the India-China War of 1962, I held a very contrary opinion as to who was responsible for things going wrong. And so I was kept out of the Indian Foreign Service on security grounds. But I stick to the position I held then. I was asked at my Foreign Service interview, what did I think of the Chinese invasion? And my response at the age of 22 was, what invasion? And the board was shocked at my response and said, haven't you heard of the Chinese invasion? And I said, what I have heard is that the Prime Minister of India has announced that he's ordered the Indian Army to throw the Chinese out. And the Chinese riposted, and is a riposte an invasion? Well, they kept me out to begin with, but then they took me in again. So obviously there is a certain ambiguity in our minds as to what ought to be this relationship with China. To go back to the very beginning, when the Chinese Communist Revolution, it used to be a communist revolution in 1949. I'm not sure it's very much of a communist revolution today, but it was in 1949 a communist revolution. And at the time that that revolution was taking place in China, the Soviet Union under Marshal Stalin was promoting a communist revolution in India and refusing to accept that India was a genuinely independent country and holding it to be part of the ideology of communism as officially interpreted in Moscow, that our democracy was a bourgeois democracy, that our independence was a false independence, and that there needed to be still the liberation of India. And yet it was in that atmosphere and at that time that Nehru attempted to become the first country in the world to accord diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China. And only as an act of courtesy conceded to Burma, as it was then called, the right to be the first country, because they felt that they had really serious problems with the Chinese and they would like to make this gesture. It's also India which, through the entire period of major conflict in the United States over the curious question, who lost China, that India persisted in standing by what it perceived as its single most important partner in the new world that was being created, namely China, with the result that when an offer was actually made secretly, but it was a well-known offer, that India take China's place in the Security Council, the UN Security Council, Jawaharlal Nehru refused, saying that we cannot, in this manner, get allied in the Cold War between the United States and the communist camp led by then the Soviet Union. Equally on the issue of Korea, which had led to war on that peninsula because the Soviet Union had made the mistake of walking out of the United Nations in 1950. At that stage, the Indian position was regarded as so undesirable by the West that the opinion subsequently got expressed that neutrality is immoral. And yet, in order to bring a definitive end to that war, it became necessary for them to turn, for the world to turn to an immoral India to be the chairman of the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission to settle what was the most acute issue relating to the establishment of an armistice in the peninsula, which was the identification of North Korean soldiers who wished to be repatriated to North Korea and South Korean soldiers who wished to be repatriated to the south, leaving those who wanted to be wherever they'd been captured, where they were. That really brought about the end of that war. And then in 1954, the relationship between India and China had grown so strong that at the Vietnam Conference in Geneva, to which India had not been invited, but in which Krishna Menon played a major role because he just went and settled himself in the Beau Rivage Hotel to make himself available and was the only manner, the only medium through which communication between the two sides could take place. And he therefore built a very, very strong relationship with the Chinese delegation there, which from time to time was led by Mr. Zhou Enlai, and of course with the Vietnamese. Pierre Mendès France, who was then the Prime Minister of France, he remarked that there were 10 people at the conference, 9 at the table and 1 outside, and that was the reference to India. And when I got posted to North Vietnam as a member of the Indian Foreign Service in 1968, I found that the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, were still thinking of the possibility of India brokering the new peace that had to be worked out. In a little while, they decided against that. But back in 1968, November, I was personally the recipient of the North Vietnamese formula for bringing the conflict to an end. I conveyed it, but then there was no real follow-up because by then our relationship with China had become so sour that we could no longer claim to have in 1968 the kind of position that we had in 1954. Also, I think, although that letter has become pretty notorious in Indian history, that the letter written by Sardar Patel, drafted by Sir Girja Shankar Bajpai to Nehru about the India-China relationship in the context of Tibet, was completely unrealistic. That the situation that had obtained before that was on account of the imperial dominance of the British over the subcontinent and the total absence of any kind of governance in China and certainly any kind of effective Chinese presence in Tibet. And that got so radically changed by 1950 that I think the Girja Shankar Bajpai Sardar Patel line was simply out of touch with ground realities. There was no way in which we could go into Tibet and protect the Tibetans against the Chinese. And it now appears from a book called 1962, which I commend to everybody's attention, that there was actually a meeting in Delhi in 1951 at which the head of the Indian Army, General Cariappa, was asked formally as to how effectively could India defend Tibet against China, and just said that there's no way we can do anything. So the ground reality is that it's between the Tibetans and the Chinese to work out their mutual relationship, and that we just cannot attempt to hold on to an order which had been bypassed by history. So I think what we were attempting to do from 1947 onwards, specifically the Asia Conference that Nehru convened on the 23rd of March 1947 here in Delhi, where the Chinese were in fact represented by Chiang Kai-shek, that desire for converting the Asian Renaissance, which had characterized the first half of the 20th century, into an Asian resurgence, which it was hoped would characterize the Asia of the second half of the 20th century, that somehow never came to pass. And it didn't come to pass simply because the India-China relationship broke down so badly between 1958, 59 and 1962 that instead of being partners, India and China came to be pitted against each other. And I think we still remain pitted against each other because there is this huge wall of suspicion about the other country's intentions. And it's always a leap in the dark to try to guess the intentions of the other side. But given the objective advantages which I think India would obtain from at least attempting to build a good relationship with China and not giving up on building that good relationship until and unless it gets definitively proven that the Chinese have no desire to have a constructive relationship with India, I think we should make the effort. And I think we should make the effort because it seems to me that the chances are that the Chinese are not getting any particular advantage out of a hostile relationship with India. And in this context, I, as someone who knows little about China but a certain amount about Pakistan, find that whereas the fear and dislike of Pakistan is visceral in this country, it's so deep-rooted, that the attitude towards China is really a bit ambiguous. There are no strong views held, except that vaguely it is felt we have to protect ourselves against the Chinese. And yet when one looks back, the Chinese did cross over into India in 1962, October, but by November, they were virtually back to where they had started from. And there has been no serious move made since then. And that's a long, long time ago. It's most of my life. They've made no particular move to capture more territory. And it is in this context that I had the good fortune to be working in the Prime Minister's office when Rajiv Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India. And I was witness, but only from the sidelines, or perhaps even from behind the sidelines, to see an initiative being taken to break a mindset. And when Rajiv Gandhi declared in 1984, on first becoming Prime Minister, that he would like to become the first Prime Minister of India in decades to go to China, the entire establishment of Indira Gandhi's were shocked at the thought and were opposed to the idea. And while Rajiv attempted to bring them on board by making them part of the advance team to go and explore the situation in China and come back, at the end of the day, he had to make a decision on the basis of a gut feeling rather than any particular hard evidence. Does he go? Does he not go? But before going, which eventually took place in December 1988, I had an experience which for me defined what Rajiv Gandhi's attitude was towards establishing a new phase of our relationship with China, which would take into account the Hindi-Chini bye-bye days, but also reflect to some extent what had happened in the 26 years between 1962 and 1988 and the decades to come. And that was when he was to go to Mizoram to declare Mizoram as a state from its position till then, which was that of a union territory. And as I was his manager tours and travels, I received a request through his private secretary that I should make arrangements for him to fly from Aizawl to Itanagar, where he wanted to hold a meeting. And while I protested that even Rajiv Gandhi couldn't control the rise of the sun or its setting, and this was an almost impossible logistical problem, still I succeeded in working out with Air Headquarters how this difficult move before the sun set could take place between Aizawl and Itanagar. And I stood in the audience as I heard Rajiv speaking. And to my astonishment, he announced statehood for Arunachal Pradesh. That had been nowhere on the agenda till then. And it was just sprung like a rabbit out of a hat from the stage in Arunachal. So when we got into the plane together at Dibrugarh for the journey back to India, I took the liberty of going into his cabin and saying to him, "Sir, but aren't you putting in jeopardy your trip to China, which was scheduled for the following year?" And he beamed in his usual manner and said, "Mani, if we don't know where our borders lie, how can we expect the Chinese to know?" So it was not a question of going there in the manner in which Chamberlain had gone to Berchtesgaden to surrender and prostrate before them and say, "You're right, we are wrong." There was an Indian point of view to be maintained, but instead of maintaining that Indian point of view outside of China, why not go to China and present that point of view? That fundamentally, establishing a relationship with China does not mean conceding to China everything that they want or giving up everything that we want. That there could be a relationship of maturity between two really rather large powers, which would involve, for a solution, give and take, but pending the arrival at that solution, to have a relationship of peace and tranquility with something constructive thrown into it that would maintain the balance. And we did go to, I was lucky enough to be in the delegation that went to China, and there was witness to this waltz that took place between Deng Xiaoping and Rajiv Gandhi. Because when Deng Xiaoping escorted Rajiv Gandhi into the great hall of the people, just one thing happened, and it was the key to everything that happened subsequently. Deng took Rajiv's hand and shook it for 8.5 minutes. And while he shook his hand for 8.5 minutes, he kind of circulated, that's why I call it a waltz. He circulated around the Great Hall of the People so that every camera in the world could record unambiguously the leaders of India and China shaking hands. Absolutely nothing was solved. The Chinese had their position on every issue. The Indians had their position on every issue. All that was really agreed, and that was the breakthrough, was that they would talk to each other about these issues. There was no other substantive move. And as a result of agreeing to talk about it, we have had, I think, 18 rounds, if I'm not mistaken, of border talks, which have led nowhere, but which have ensured observance of the agreement on peace and tranquility at the borders, which came about 6 years after Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China. So it's that kind of a breakthrough that I think we still need to make. After all, if the Chinese withdrew from territory that they claimed and held for about a month in 1962, and haven't, apart from minor scraps at the border, actually attempted to recapture that. And don't forget, Tawang was in their hands. And even the Dalai Lama claims Tawang for himself. So, if they were ready to move out of Tawang, and years later when I became Minister for the Development of the Northeast region, I asked Dorji Khandu, who became CM in my time and was from Tawang, I said, where were you during the Chinese occupation of Tawang? And his eyes lit up, and he said, I was 7 years old. So I said, and what was the occupation like? He said, we had the best time of our lives because the Chinese brought in a 16mm projector. And for the first time, the boys of Tawang were able to get together in the city center and watch this projection of propaganda films from China, which generally showed Mao Zedong applauding himself and didn't have very much more substance to it. But it was their first exposure to the 21st century. And later the same Dorji Khandu told Foreign Minister Pranab Mukherjee at the time, in my presence, in what was supposed to be a secret meeting, but hell, this is one secret that should be shared with everybody. He said, sir, we have 6 lakh families in Arunachal. And of them, 2.5 lakh have relatives across the border in Tibet. And he said that there is no formal communication within these families, but everyone knows which are the passes along the Arunachal-Tibet border where letters can be exchanged and sent to the different families. And so the story of what is happening in Tibet is well known to our people, and our people are asking, if so much development can come to Tibet, why isn't it coming to Arunachal Pradesh? And now, of course, we've gone into a flurry of establishing the kind of development that will enable us to give the people there a fair chance. But for 30 years, it was the accepted wisdom of all our experts, our military experts, our diplomatic experts, our ideological experts, that we dare not build up infrastructure on the border between India and China, because then the Chinese will use that infrastructure in order to come into India. And when I suggested as Minister of Petroleum that we should be laying a pipeline between Ledo and Kunming along the same route that had been done in the Second World War, and which was the fundamental reason for the liberation of China from Japanese colonial rule, and that's the road along which the Stillwell Road had been built. Our establishment in external affairs or in the embassy was up in arms in fury, saying if we build that road, then the Chinese will come down that road when they attack India. So I mean, it's for the fundamental choice to be made is, are you deeply convinced that the Chinese covet us, that they feel inadequate with only 1,500 million people and would like to grab another 120 billion? Or are they by and large content to be where they are, and are we by and large content to be where we are? Yes, we claim Aksai Chin, but looking at my friend immediately opposite me, I'm tempted to say that when Nehru announced in Parliament that not a blade of grass grows on that plateau, Mahavir Tyagi got up and pointed to his bald head and said, there's not a blade of grass that grows on this plateau, but does that mean it's useless? So in order to put hair onto Mahavir Tyagi's head, we have this theological claim to Aksai Chin, which is of absolutely no use to us. It's not even of any use to our yaks. But the Chinese have a need for it. They want to link Xinjiang with Tibet. And they used the road. They built it. And we didn't know it being built. And we didn't know it being built until an invitation came to the Indian ambassador in Beijing to attend the inauguration. So, how much are we going to be attached to this mythology? And if you are going to be attached to mythology and produce evidence that Aksai Chin belonged to us when Gulab Singh betrayed the Sikh community in order to come to a deal with the British and get hold of Kashmir and Ladakh, because that was what the dirty deal was in the 1840s, then why don't we go back to the Mahabharata and say that Kandhara obviously came from Kandahar, and therefore we have a total claim on Afghanistan. And it is true that one of the reasons why Aurangzeb didn't like his father is that his father sent the other three sons he had to salubrious spots in India and sent Aurangzeb to Balkh and Badakhshan in Afghanistan, and he resented having to go abroad all those years because then it was considered part of India. So history moves on, and if we can at least bring ourselves to consider that what was offered to us allegedly in 1959 by Zhou Enlai, which was a settlement based on effectively the status quo at that time, that we were up to the McMahon line in the northeast, and that the Chinese were in a part of Aksai Chin at that same time, and that on the basis of these ground realities, rather than the claims made by Manchu emperors in some century and by Young Husband in 1907, that we should be still fighting over that today. It seems to me that if we can at some stage arrive at such a solution, well and good, but it doesn't matter if we don't get to that solution so long as we maintain peace and tranquility at the border and build up our relationship in other respects. Now, what we have, almost in spite of ourselves, done is build up a huge trade relationship. And an important component of that trade relationship is that all the Ganapatis that are taken into the sea at the time of the Ganapati Utsav in Maharashtra, they made in China. And that puja cannot be celebrated any longer in Bengal if China just ceased to make all the Durga Murtis, which we import from them and use here. Have we lost? What have we lost? So therefore, there are many more significant areas into which we could move if we just broke this mental barrier. And to break that mental barrier is feasible where it is so difficult with Pakistan. I personally think that it's easier done with Pakistan than with China because we speak the same language. The elite speaks English and the others speak Hindustani, comprehensible to the Urdu speaker. And the villains of the piece are both Punjabis on either side. I mean, it's their civil war that we are living with still. So we should be able to make the breakthrough with Pakistan. And the difficulty with China really is that despite the claims, there's been virtually no civilizational contact between India and China. We find it difficult even to pronounce the name of the minister of the Chinese embassy. So, I agree that China is a dark hole as far as our knowledge of them is concerned. But what do we know about Luxembourg? What do we know about Colombia, where I was last week? We know nothing about most of the world. And we also know nothing about most of India. So therefore, it's going to be quite a job to build this up. And what we knew about England, we are by and large forgetting now. My generation knew, but the next generation is not even taught Shakespeare. And if we do know America better today, it's a cause of considerable despair rather than excitement. So in these circumstances, yes, there has to be a major effort made to get China better known in India. But is Chinese history taught in any of our schools? For that matter, is South Indian history taught in any of our schools? There is a need to restructure our education systems to incorporate what is undoubtedly the single most important rising power of the 21st century, which is the People's Republic of China. But we are taught French history for a country that doesn't matter. And we know a great deal about Britain. We know how to order William I and William IV. But what does that country matter? It's just an island stuck out in a distant sea. Counts for absolutely nothing. And yet the way in which our information is structured, whether it's school education or the media, we are much more obsessed with what Theresa May thinks of Jeremy Corbyn, and we don't even know the names of the principal protagonists in the Chinese drama. And I see that China is changing. For me, my moment of revelation was walking into a mall in Beijing. I thought good communist countries don't have malls. But anyway, I went into this mall and I looked down from the 4th floor and there was an ice rink on the ground floor. There were all these pretty Chinese girls skating around there, and the music that came into my ears was Lara's theme from Dr. Zhivago. And I said to myself, am I in a communist country? And we just had Xi Jinping go to Davos and make a speech that Roosevelt or Truman might have been proud of making. So the world's changing. Things are changing. The Chinese somehow seem to be able to adapt themselves to changing conditions much faster than we are able to do here in India. And maybe in that pragmatic sense, there is a great deal that we could learn from China. After all, we were at virtually the same level when I was a college student. And after that, they went into the Cultural Revolution, which was a form of chaos that we luckily in India have not known. And then they emerged from it, and once they emerged from it, I remember reading a book by L.K. Jha, who was the main architect of our license permit Raj. It was called Economic Strategy for the 80s. And the subtitle should have said, by Deng Xiaoping. It was the strategy that was being worked out in China, for China, in the same decade of the late 70s and early 80s, was being done here in India. But they got down to it there, and they leapt ahead of us, but we may yet be able to catch up or at least arrive at a respectable position vis-a-vis them if we stopped quarreling and started being friends. So if the School of Journalism contributes, as I'm sure it will, to filling this dark hole, and if the attitude, the general overall attitude towards China displayed so brilliantly before us by Professor Alka Acharya were to become the Indian attitude towards China, then I think we ought to have the self-confidence that surely that would influence the Chinese into also looking towards us with what Nehru at independence called clear and friendly eyes. He said we'd look upon the world with clear and friendly eyes on Independence Day. And somehow most of the time our eyes are cloudy, misty. We see enemies in China, we see enemies in Pakistan and enemies, friends there. They have a road that they have built through a part of Kashmir that we are never going to get back, in the same way as Pakistan will never get Srinagar. We ought to remember that whatever was the conversation between Zhou Enlai and Bhutto at Karachi airport in 1965 August, ultimately the Chinese only protested about the Indian soldiers having stolen 32 sheep from the Chinese army. They didn't come in on the east as the Pakistanis were expecting them to come in a pincer movement. And now history has shown us that in 1971, that scoundrel Henry Kissinger actually went to the Chinese permanent representative to beg him to invade India so as to stop what was happening in the liberation of Bangladesh. And the Chinese said no. And why is it that these are stories we do not know? Twice over, the Chinese have stood by us, notwithstanding their eternal friendship with Pakistan. And if today the eternal friendship with Pakistan is giving us a China-Pakistan economic corridor, why are we looking upon that as a hostile act towards us? And why are we pushing Chabahar as an alternative? The Chabahar route will take us through the western part of the Central African republics, the Caspian Sea region, out towards Europe. The CPEC will take us from our subcontinent into the eastern part of Central Asia and out into China. To be able to fly to Doha, either by Qatar Airways or Air India, is regarded as progress. To be able to go into Central Asia by two alternative routes, one through Chabahar, is regarded as poking the Pakistanis in the eye, and the other, God forbid, is going from Gwadar, because then that would mean to concede the Karakoram Pass to Pakistan and therefore to China. Why are we living in these worlds of fantasy? We'll never get the Karakoram Pass back. We never will. And I don't think we'll ever allow the Chinese to take over Tawang. So long as we know where our borders lie, where our real borders lie, and say we'll protect that if there is an incursion there, and arrive at a settlement that will enable us to remove all the blocks from our minds and our policies that would enable us to realize the vision of 1947, which was that the 20th century, leave alone the 21st century, would be built on this axis of India and China. And then who is going to look us in the eye? There used to be a Roman Empire, remember? Now there's a tiny country called Italy. There used to be a British Empire. Now there's a tiny island off the continent called, well, the United Kingdom, when its real name should be the Disunited Kingdom. And then we have the French Empire, which is part of history, and now it's a tiny town, there's a tiny country that fights about what is the best of 253 varieties of cheese. The Germans attempted to establish Deutschland über alles by war. They totally failed and they totally won in peace. It is Deutschland über alles all over the European Union. So, in these changing circumstances, my plea is that we have a change of mindset and start looking at the Chinese as our best potential friends. And to do that, we have to learn how to distinguish in our minds between she and Liu and understand whether it's she or she. These are the kind of new civilizational problems that we have to cope with, and I think we really should. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Ms. Iyer, for your truly inspiring but a comprehensive tour de force on the history and evolution and past and present and future of the India-China relationship. We are really grateful to you for taking that time out, and I'm particularly delighted that we have recorded this for posterity. And I hope that our students in the future have an opportunity, particularly the Center for India-China Studies, get to listen to this extraordinary, what was expected to be an inaugural address was nothing short of a distinguished public lecture. So without further ado, now I want to alert all of you that we are still on schedule. We're going to reduce our tea break and assemble back in say 10-15 minutes. I now would like to present a token of appreciation to our distinguished visitors here.